been honored as one of the ID 40, ID Magazine's selection of America's leading design innovators. Lucille studied at California College of the Arts and holds an MBA and MFA in design from Cranbrook Academy of Art. All right, with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Lucille and I'll come back and host the Q&A later on. See you.
Okay, thank you, Lishan. And thanks, welcome everybody to this webinar, which is called One Design, One Work. And so when I was approached by Susan a few months ago to participate in this event, I was thinking of what have I done, what have I seen that has affected my work profoundly. And so I thought I would look back, in reviewing other people's webinars, I saw that they were referring to other people's work as inspirational for them. But I realized that I think in my case, there's some bodies of work that one is engaged in that really affects the trajectory that they will take. And for me, I think it was a project I did when I was a graduate student at Cranbrook in 1980. I graduated in 82. So this was a project that was really my introduction to vernacular. And when you think of vernacular, you think of local or, I looked up the word and I thought, what does it mean? If it's linguistic, it's something that is maybe based on a dialect spoken by ordinary people. If it's about architecture, if it's vernacular architecture, maybe it's something that is domestic as opposed to, like these public or monumental buildings, but they're smaller scale and functional. So, it also has some reference to domesticated, something that is popular or perhaps lowbrow. So, when you think of design and lowbrow, there's been this sort of dichotomy of what's a highbrow and lowbrow. And for me, my introduction to this sort of vernacular started with this project when I was at Cranbrook. So, at the time arriving, from the Philippines, from Manila, where I had graduated from art and advertising program and had worked professionally for 3 years, I landed in the US, first in San Francisco, and then was accepted at Cranbrook 6 months later. And I realized there was this buzz around this book and that we were being asked to read this book. And, people may know, this is now almost 50 years old, this book called Learning from Las Vegas, which was initiated by a project that the architect Robert Venturi and his wife and partner Denise Scott Brown wrote upon, confronted with the landscape of Las Vegas. And I guess for them, it was really about looking at a city that's been, quote, manufactured, that it wasn't really a city, that it was, there was the strip that was the sort of back or skeleton of this city that has where parking lots, gambling casinos, we know, hotels, etc., bars have evolved, from this particular strip. So the group made up of these architects and students from Yale decided to go there on a field trip and established a studio called Learning from Las Vegas, and was really looking at analyzing the symbols, patterns, the styles of the signs of the city. And this is what they were confronted with, maybe you don't see this as much anymore, but I'm bringing this up because there's this really cacophony of, messages that, that sort of like fight with each other, or in fact, may actually coexist pleasantly with each other for the obvious reason of attracting people to go into their establishments. So this is an amazing portrait of Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi in 1968, when they went to Las Vegas, and you don't see this landscape anymore. This is what they did in terms of their study, and mapping all these things that I mentioned earlier in terms of the symbols that they encountered. And this is Las Vegas at night, which of course is really this, the magnet of lights. But here's a kind of contrast of what Golden Nugget looked like in the 1970s or when it started, and this is what it looks now, what it looks like now in the 2000s. It's been cleaned up. It's no longer the vernacular. Maybe it's still the vernacular, but as you can see, it's just such a big difference. And now what you realize is that the landscape of Las Vegas in terms of its vernacular no longer resides in the signs, because these replicas of, in this case, the pyramid, and then you have the Eiffel Tower, you have casinos that are like the Bellagio and the Venetian that are exact replicas, or more or less, but they can't really be exact, of what of their sources. And so the buildings are now the messages. They carry the sort of baggage of information, but you no longer see the signs that were on street level that Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown saw. Which brings me to my country. I'm from the Philippines. I grew up there. I came to this country when I was in my 20s, and I realized vernacular exists in my country in the form of these jeepneys. And for anybody who's been to the Philippines and is familiar with these sort of iconic symbols of my country, these are these colorful and popular modes of transportation. And they were originally made by, very inventive Filipinos, I would like to add, by modifying these US Jeeps, military Jeeps that were left behind after World War II. And so they became practically synonymous with the Philippines in the late 40s. And, much like maybe double-decker buses in the UK, bullet trains in Japan, and these tuk-tuks in Thailand. So this is so quintessentially Philippines. And I just read that the government has been setting up new specifications. And so they are trying to do a makeover of these public conveyances. So we'll see what happens, because a lot of these are illegal. And so they want to make sure that they comply with the new standards of transportation as well for safety. But I hope they don't mess with it. I would hope so, that it stays the way it is. I just love how, when I was at college, from elementary up to college, I would ride these jeepneys one place to another, and they were I was probably not even aware that they were these moving billboards, if you will. And that image on the right, especially if you were there, and that's why there's so much traffic in the Philippines. They just clog the streets, but it's like this feast for the eyes. So why this project? Why am I referring to a project that I did back when I was a student? And I think there's some pivotal moments when discoveries, you discover something about what you see, what your response is. So our project in my final year at Cranbrook, actually my final semester, Kathy McCoy, one of the co-directors at the time, had asked us to go out in Detroit or out in the environment and just document it. And for us, we were just, okay, just take your camera, go out there. So I took pictures of this one section on 6 Mile Road. And if anybody is familiar with Detroit, this is 6 Mile Road is the kind of demarcation from downtown, from Detroit, the city limits, to the next city. So I took pictures, and it was kind of I came back to my studio and I said, what do I do with these pictures? They're just like signs of things, and still flush with what Robert Venturi did. And upon reading what Learning from Las Vegas was about, I said, how can I make this something that was also exploratory for me? And so on the surface, I think you don't know, and I think this is what graduate school taught me. And I tell my students this all the time, because there's there's a big question mark about when you are confronted with something and you have really no idea what you're supposed to make of it. It's a challenge. It's also diving in, risk taking. And so I remember asking Kathy McCoy, I said, what do I do with this thing? What do I do with these images? And she said, Lucille, you're the designer. You're the graduate student. You should be the one asking questions. And so she sort of turned that question to me. And then I realized, okay, I have to go back in there and make write everything that I see on the facade, from the facade, and then create some sort of system from this, vernacular signs. that, as you can see, is a mix of, a drugstore, you have a liquor store, you have like the quick printing shops, and you have the street signs of no parking. Anyway, so I edited them and then arrived at some of these images. But this one was my first exploration of trying to make something out of nothing, if you will. And it was really my first attempt at monumentality without showing the monument, if you will. No, it's like the negative versus the positive. And so when I looked at the information I had on my yellow pad, of course, this is all handwritten, I realized that I could categorize this information. That on the one hand, there were dry goods, leather goods, TV stores, books. And then there were also things that related to, there were a couple of animal supply stores. There was a store that sold fish, tropical fish, etc. And I thought, oh, I could like, there's enough information to clump them all together. Maybe not as much, but that's why I was creating texture there with the A, because there was not much I can put. But that was me defining the negative with the information. So this, to me, looking back, really it sort of propelled me to look at typography as an image. How can words not just be read but be seen? And so services, so that's why it's cut off, because I thought, well, there were some parking signs, instant printing, so this is all going in my head. And then I decided, okay, now Lucille, just go in and dive into the information you have and use some typography, scale. And, when you arrive, I was the only one creating the parameters on this one. And so I realized that I could make Barry visually bigger than everything else, because it was the biggest store on the block. It made perfect sense. So this is where design is rational. It could be intuitive, but at the same time, it's rational. So the vertical typography is really those parking meters, right? I mean, they're vertical, so why not make them vertical? So all of these things were kind of this decisions I made as I kept looking at this information, which, as you can see, was if you can visualize what I had in front of me, was just typeset typography, and we didn't have computers at the time. We only had this typesetting machine. So this is cut and paste, which in fact, by the way, this on the left, that prescriptions and the goods, those are all individually cut by hand, and they're falling apart now. But I try to save them, because I look back on this as a young person without the computer and just using my hand and the tools that I had available. And I realized, my students don't do this anymore. They just have to use, Illustrator. So it's always kind of a surprising thing for our students now to see this work and the processes that we were engaged in. So then I started to include photography, the photographs that I took from the beginning, from those contact sheets. And I was so particularly enamored by this mosaic wall of this drugstore that had an RX. And as you can see, I also added some of my hand drawings. Those lines are all drawn by pencil. So there's this collage component, and this complexity was starting to be, something I was very familiar with, and I liked doing it. I like this multiple layers that was very challenging, because the question I had, and maybe this was not even a conscious question, was how do you make it work so that there's layers and layers, but that it doesn't get muddy, it doesn't get complicated. There's a kind of, how can I say, almost like a choreography of information that you can use with the typography that you have. So these are the two, from the simple to, starting to insinuate photography. And then this is when I get crazy. At this point, the fragmentation shows up, the diagonal sign, all of this, by the way, those two shades of blue are cut film. So again, it's my hand cutting this. And I think this is what I realized, that maybe part of the process of being able to do this so spontaneously is that your hand is doing it spontaneously, that you trust where your hand is going. And with a computer now, you only have your mouse and your wrist moving, and it's not the same. Whereas I could make this happen in like at the spur of the in like in a split second. Even the cut squares there, like where the mosaic tiles are kind of like floating in space. That was me again. So you can see some of the residual components from the previous compositions. And this took all of 10 weeks, right? And at Cranbrook, we don't have classes. We meet once a week. This is a very strong studio practice. So you're always confronted with this on my, I was confronted with this on my desk, on my wall every day. I'm thinking, what's next? What am I going to do next? And then I started to put, some pieces together that just dealt with the language of the street. Street signs, parking signs, the clouds, the numbers of those establishments, etc. No parking signs, and so this one really is more about the kind of context and not the stores themselves. So what did this teach me? On many levels, it's like being given a stack of information that have no connection except that they were all extracted from the store. And of course, they don't have anything to do with each other. The drugstore doesn't have anything to do with the parking sign, or maybe it just happens to be in front of it. But what can a designer do to tie them all together? And so these are all, and there's more of these, but I'm only showing you the 4 that I think really kind of encapsulated for me my interest in experimental typography. And also, more than anything, looking at typography, as I said earlier, not as something you just read. You can read it because you are literate. You can decipher letters. You can read Barry, Barry. But at the same time, you can see it. So this is where typography becomes an image for me, or a series of images. And more than anything, this collage approach that I used became for me a way to look at typography as a part of a landscape. That there was this opportunity to look at them in perspective, that they're floating in space, that they're in the landscape, they're like below eye level or above eye level, or they're above me. It suddenly became this active component that isn't just at the bottom of the page, that you don't touch them, you just want to make sure that people read it. But that invasion of typography for me within the picture plane was so crucial. So one of the projects I did after this project, or maybe simultaneous, was we were like your typical school project, right? A history project. And I was so enamored by the Russian constructivists at the time, but I was also interested in Rodchenko because he was a writer and a poet. And so my challenge as a student was, if I were to design something about Rodchenko without him looking at this and just say, hey, you're knocking me or something, you're mimicking me, you can never be me, right? I was so aware of that. I thought, I want to do an homage to him, so that to this person, to this personality, this design historian, in my design history, so that I can represent his ethos in my work, in this design. So I have his logo right there in the square. This amazing photography of this woman, that perspectival, the shadow on her face, on her dress. I continued on to the floor. So these were things that I think evolved because of that project, because of that street signs project. And then after a while, I realized, I was so good at it, and I was getting really frustrated by, well, maybe it's not frustration, but I was getting too comfortable. And I think this is one of the questions a designer always asks themselves, and said, Lucille, you could do that with your eyes closed. You're so good with this overlapping stuff and, perspective, typography as landscape. But, how can you like be minimal? Maybe stay away. You've done the vernacular. What is the opposite of vernacular? Modernist? What is it? Or maybe you can do layering still, but maybe this time it's not physical layering, but it is conceptual layering. And so in 1990, I was confronted with this project to design a poster for this architectural group in San Francisco. It's called 2AES, which is architecture, I forget now, art and architecture exhibition space. So 2AES. And they were a young, they were like my contemporaries. They were doing experimental things in architecture. They had an exhibit space. And so they said, we want you to design this poster that is going to be a call for entries for architecture students, that they would present, conceptual projects, etc. And so I put aside my complexity layering collage approach, and I told myself, what can you do if you had a singular image that you did not touch? You didn't cut it up, you didn't collage it, but it was still complicated. And so, because it's provocative. And, this is at the time also I was married to my husband, a photographer, Richard Barnes, who was working in this mode of black and white photography. A lot of it was very ambiguous. And so I saw this, and he was throwing this out, this image. And I said, what is this? And he said, oh, it's a shrouded image of one of the sculptures at Cranbrook because it's in the middle of winter. And so for protection, it's covered. And I said, there's something about this that appeals to me. So this is what I did. My challenge, and this is me challenging myself, was to look at this image and then and talk to me, like, tell me, are you about architecture? And so I thought, you are architecture, right? You are an image that is about architecture because you're a built form, but maybe you also are an open-ended structure. And so the words around this sculpture, this photograph, are architectural. So in the middle, dead center, is sight. And then all around, contiguous, tangent, circumnavigate, proximity. Those 5 words have an architectural context. And so that was me in my brain thinking, this is what you can offer as a designer, is to also have your work reflect your own questions, your own process, the kinds of things that, other people may look at and just say, nobody told me not to stop doing what I was doing. But I had to tell myself, stop that for now and see what you can do. So 2 years later, they came back, Lucille, that was great. That poster with the shrouded figure was great because these students, we were, in architecture school, were looking at that and said, oh, I can submit anything. It opened up the possibility of what architecture or built form could be. So 2 years later, I went back and they went back to me. And then I designed this poster similarly with a singular image, but with typography now as having a more, how can I say, interactive, and also with some missing words. And the interactive part of it obviously is interacting with the picture as well as with your brain, that you're thinking that you're supposed to complete the word. I mean, we know what it is. Even if it's incomplete, I think that's to me the interactive part, is having people engage with it. So that attitude of the typography as landscape became a kind of focus of my work. Even with designing logos, this was an identity system for the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, which is a part or under the umbrella of the University of Washington. So it was called the Henry. And I said, okay, this is great. I look at this monolithic H and I said, how can I make this more, Henry is such a kind of how can I say, almost like a grandfatherly name, and it's like a human being. And this H, I thought, could represent a person. Why not, right? And so I had 2 versions, one with just multiple H's, but the other one with this Henry, as if it was, in this landscape of H's, which I see as part of this typography and landscape process I was going through. So in 1994, one of my projects was a book cover for Chronicle Books on the body. This book had already been published in Europe, but because it is being reproduced in the US, there was an opportunity for the publisher to actually redesign the cover. So they went to me. And so I designed this cover on the front, and on the back, I thought, I'd like to show life and death, that there's life by the representation of this form, or the kind of sliver of this woman's body and her leg. And then in the back was this wonderful vertebrae. and it's, obviously representing the skeleton. So I wanted this bookends of front and back. But as you can see here, I was also looking at the configuration of the body, and maybe because of that exercise, the previous exercises, it led up to me being creating this typography as a kind of companion to the image. That when I look at the image, it almost needs something as an armature, or to kind of enhance the composition of this image. So in this case, for example, you're looking at Leonardo da Vinci's very famous, Renaissance man, this sort of cruciform configuration of the man and the hands outstretched. You know what I'm talking about. But that's what I tried to do with the body, and fortuitously with 4 letters, it was perfect. Using all caps, and then in the inside pages, the table of contents, I wanted to do something that was also organic. That with the titles of the chapters, words like figures, arrows, mind, flesh. I thought I love just the singular words that are defining the chapter openings. What can I do with them? And so they're also this sort of undulating, kind of curvature, maybe similar to the back page. But then I revisited this design, actually. Every once in a while I go back to the design. Years later, I thought, if I were to now look at what I was thinking at the time, I would probably juxtapose this wonderful words of this chapter openings on that vertebrae. That that for you, the audience, look at this and just say, this is a skeleton. Why do you want me to think of arrows? The person is dead. But I think I like that extension. I like to imagine what words and images can do to each other, where they complete each other, they question each other, or they, in fact, maybe like go in the opposite directions, but still it's engaging. So that process led me to so many of these experiments, these designs, where I was never content with letting the typography just sit at the bottom of the page. Or, I always, and I've extended this to my students also, I tell them, don't be afraid to get into the ring. Don't be afraid to look at the typography, look at the images, and just say, how can I complete you? What can I add to you, so that we are in a way like piggybacking on each other. And then likewise with some of these, maybe you can see this now as a kind of synthesis of both the collage-like process that I did with the street signs, and then the rationality also, and the geometry that is the disciplinary part of this experimentation that I was going through. But regardless, I think the common denominator to all of these is the fact that I see typography as an equal player in the image making process. So some of my, this is a project I did when I started at Parsons. This is actually for the School of Constructed Environments right there. So the dean at the time asked me to design a poster that would be a recruitment poster, where all 4 programs would be under one umbrella, under the SCE. So there's product design, lighting design, architecture, interior. And so I harked back on what I had done, and I thought, how can I highlight these 4 programs, 4 related but different, and then highlighting student work, highlighting faculty work, and what can I show that when you get the sort of synthetic, when I say synthetic, I'm not talking artificial, but the synthesis of these 4 disciplines, what would it look like? And so I came up with the poster on the left. That's one side of it. And then I was looking at how can I do something at the back, which is, to me, this is the poetic and the pragmatic. The pragmatic is in the front, or maybe there's no front really. I don't want to privilege front and back. When you say back, it looks like it's an afterthought, or maybe something that you did last. But I like to look at this as 2 sides. That one side, you have more information. It's the pragmatic. What is it? And then on the other side, it is, what is it? What are you trying to say? And so I actually love this part the best, because for me, again, it's like what I did with those, with the initial posters for 2AES. I want you to think about this. I want you to flip through this poster and realize it's like a mirroring. It's a mirror image. They're like, if you look at the white shadow on one side, it's exactly the same shape as the other more literal shadow on the image or complexity of images, the collage of images on the other side. So I continually think about what I'm revealing and what am I showing. And likewise, what can I make you think and leave behind? And so maybe this is a really good ending for me, because when I think of vernacular, and I think of what typography is to me as it's evolved over my almost 40-year career. And when I started in 1981 with that project, and it's always sustained me. But then I saw this person's work, this woman, Maria Lai, who is Italian, and she's from Sardinia. She died in 2013 at the age of 93. And I saw her work by chance in Rome. I was going into one of these galleries and I saw her work and I thought, what is she about? So she was a Sardinian artist who lived in Rome, but, spent the better part of her life actually in Rome. But what's interesting is that she started working on projects like this, that, they were called sewn books, right? And they were, there's something about Maria Lai. If you look her up, she was one of the first Italian artists. You may not have heard of her, but she was looking at typography in this way. They were so there are a lot of these books. There's hundreds of them. And I, again, by chance, saw an exhibit of her work, one person work in Rome at the Maxi, MAXXI. And it was a retrospective. And she's such a prolific, overwhelming artist that when I start to look at what typography is, I realized this is really about what communication can be. It led me to understand what is asemic writing. And asemic writing is really something that has no meaning. It's the opposite of semantic. It has no, maybe the smallest unit of meaning. But what I appreciate about this is that maybe there is a way for communication to happen in some strange way, that there is a vacuum of meaning, which is what I did with all those letters that were cut off and missing some letters, but you could still figure it out. You could still find, understand what it meant, but then it is left for the reader to fill in and interpret. And so I guess I would leave you with that, because, I started, my whole trajectory has always been this sort of linguistic exploration, having been born in the Philippines, being bilingual from a young age, and coming to the US where I speak the language fluently. But for me, it wasn't a way to go to the source, right? You come from a country where you were colonized by Spain, America, and then you go to the source of that language and you realize, how can I make this my own? It's not, there's nothing to bridge. There's nothing to bridge because I get it. I understand. I can communicate. I know how it's pronounced. But then how can I make it my own way? And I think through wordplay, for somebody who is dissecting language in the way I do, is only for somebody who didn't speak it, I guess, spontaneously, but learned it academically. And so I arrive at this non-language, but it to me is still language. Anyway, comes full circle from understanding also to understanding, I hope. Thank you. I'm going to stop the share now.
All right. Thank you so much, Lucille, for that presentation, showing examples of your own work and the things that have inspired it, helping us to connect some of those dots and this through lines of your career. So I just wanted to shout out to the audience again. Thank you for your comments in the chat. I open it up to questions. If you want to type your questions in the Q&A, you can also raise your hand here in the webinar and we can promote you so you can ask your question out loud to Lucille. While you think about questions to ask, I will kick things off with the first question for Lucille. You showed us some examples of your work that were basically created in a completely analog manner, which is before my time. And I'm curious now, as an educator, like, how do you bring in these analog elements to your teaching for students who maybe are even more than me, like truly digital natives? And how do you bring back some of these techniques and what we can gain from them?
Well, yeah, that is a challenge because I tell my students when I was in, a student like you in 81, in fact, even previously in college in 75, when I graduated from the Philippines, I mean, I didn't have my I mean, there was no laptop, for example. So what did I rely on? And so but I talk about, color, for example. I think it's so important because when I ask my students, what color are you using? And they'd say, I'm just going to go to my, on the computer and there's a scroll down menu. I said, how do you know what color that is? Because on the screen, is it CMYK? Is it RGB? Already it's fugitive, right?
Right.
And then when you tell me you're going to print it, what is it, laser or inkjet? I mean, again, and what's your substrate? Is it like a smooth paper? Is it like archival paper? Those colors are not going to be the same. Whereas I had to mix my own paints. I know what pigmentation is about. So I tell them, you don't have that anymore. Okay, you want to buy? Go to an art store and mix paints. Some of you have that interest, but if not, where do you look? So I tell them to observe things very closely. Go out there. I give projects where they have to actually use their eyes.
Yeah.
Not on their laptop, so that it's not mediated by what they see on the screen, because it is not to be, how can I say, it's not to be trusted.
Yeah.
There, you can trust it up to a point, but it is not, it's not authentic. Oh, I hate that word now because it's so overused, but but how do you get the reality of it? So, okay, I tell them, when you're looking around, what do you notice? You are visual people, so your eyes are attuned differently from somebody else. So
Right.
I can show you what I've done, but I even from their standpoint, they said, but how can I learn this? How can I learn this? They don't have color theory in school anymore. Right? But in, like, at Parsons, for example, we have our first year is all about materiality. So fine, that's great. You're actually, what is it that you're interested in? Wood, metal, paint, anything that it will connect you with the material world is good.
Right.
Because you just have to seek it out. That's the only way. Because if it's not given to you in school anymore, then you have to find it in yourself to search it.
Right. Yeah, it's like pixels are material too, but if we treat it as like the default or like the only material, then it's so limiting, right? Because we forget all of these other things in our
Right.
world around us.
Exactly.
My second question is about something you were mentioning towards the end of your presentation about language and how you were exploring language, maybe just letters as forms in themselves, the asemic, as you were saying. Have you explored sort of other scripts and other alphabets or things that where you don't know the language, just to kind of treat that as pure form and shape? And is that a different relationship for you versus, say, like, English or the Roman alphabet, where you do know exactly what's going on there?
Well, I think we are confronted with this when you're, like, if you look at design from all over the world, right? If I look at a design that has language or characters that I don't know, but I love the pure form of it. That's my entry point. And I may look at certain words, but obviously I'm not a polymath in terms of languages. I can't.
Right.
I mean, my son happens to speak or studied 6 languages, but I think for maybe that's something he picked up just because it's like, usually the next generation is better than the one before it. But my sense is that, my entry point to the beauty of language was calligraphy, and I actually I'm one of those people. When I was younger, I always got high grades for penmanship. And I'm so proud of my handwriting that I still write. I write letters because I like to see it. And I know that, when students are looking at, like they're writing script, and it's not it's a muscle, right, in your hand that you have to
Yeah.
really exercise. And I know that handwriting changes as you get older, but I try to maintain that fluidity in my hand. So in your question, for example, Bodoni, last year was the 200th anniversary of the publication of the Manuale Typographicum, which you may have heard about. But there is a Bodoni Museum in Parma, in Italy, and the curator, Silvana Amano, was actually reading. I mean, if you look at the the Manuale Tipografico of Giambattista Bodoni, and you could look at this. I mean, there's been reprints of the book, but he was so enamored by other languages, other scripts as well. And so, you look at this and you look at them, as I said, I can't read them, but I see them. They are form. They're visual form to me. They're not linguistic, but they could be decorative, sometimes. So when I see somebody, for example, somebody's work, like a colleague of mine who's, say, Japanese, right, or Chinese or Russian, and you don't speak the language, you don't understand what it says, but you can appreciate the formal language. So that's why, to me, that asemic writing, and there's several artists who have done this. They were in an exhibition at MoMA many years ago, and I look at them and just say, are they designers? Are they artists? Right? Because for them, it's not necessary to read it, but they're looking at the materiality, like Maria Lai, who actually was looking at the tactility of the book in cloth and sewing it. So I think that's I love language from that standpoint.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Even better if I read it.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, it's like Arabic and Persian calligraphy that I find so beautiful, right? And it's like, I know the alphabet, but I can't really read those languages. I don't know those languages at all, but it's just like, oh, I learned the alphabet just to like at least appreciate it a little bit more.
Yeah, and what about hieroglyphics, right? I mean, when any kid has always been interested in Egypt, their first introduction of language, perhaps, before, it's just pictorial languages, character-based. And hieroglyphics, to me, is so potent.
Yeah. And also that materiality again, right? Because there were the hieroglyphics that were carved into the stone, but then also the papyrus versions, right? Yeah. So we have some audience questions popping up. First one is from Christy. Lucille, thank you for speaking today. That's Christy thanking you. Is there anything that you have not explored yet that you were itching to try?
Several. What have I not tried yet? Okay, let me just say, I don't know how to use InDesign, right? People ask me, that is so amazing. How can you design that way? So, and so many years ago in 2016, I was on sabbatical, and I decided to go to London. I thought I would like to just live there. I just want to live there for an extended period of time. And, because you go in and visit friends, and then you're gone, right? So I thought I want to get into the fabric of a city, and maybe 3 months would be a good time. And so a colleague of mine who teaches at the Royal College said, Lucille, if you're on sabbatical and you live here, why don't you just do a workshop? Okay, so I said, yeah, I'll do a workshop. And so I did. And I said, I have some time on my hands. Maybe can I have one of the students teach me InDesign? I said, give me a project. Yeah. Okay, Christy, my answer to your question is, I want to see how, and maybe I have not felt compelled, to really deal with this as a serious effort. And I don't know, but for me to actually look at the digital devices and say, what can you do with it in the way that your brain was doing with your hand? I'm the only one that can figure that out, because I know what my hand is capable of, but what can my hand do on my wrist, on that mouse, when I actually am hacking a software, right? If I'm hacking a piece of software, like some people tell me, Lucille, can you imagine what you can do if you actually were doing it yourself and not working with a designer? and because I'm sketching everything out, I'm laying everything out. I work with my assistants, and I'll tell them, this is how I want it to look like. Okay, I want this letter B cutting off, and I want this like black and white, but then it crosses over, and it's going to have that bit of transparency. And they look, and I can see it in my brain, right, very quickly.
Yeah.
And they say, Lucille, I have to go to Photoshop now. Can you just come back in 10 minutes? And I said, okay, 10 minutes. Is that how long it's going to take? It's already in my brain. I know what it looks like. And so true enough, I come back 10 minutes later. It's exactly what I saw in my head. And so I thought, can I shortcut that if I were actually the one doing it? So Christy, in answer to your question, that is my next trajectory. Like to just go into to have a student, just not a student, a young designer who's like a savvy with all these software, and just say, Lucille, here, I'll teach you for 2 hours and then I'll leave you alone and you go crazy. That kind of thing.
That sounds like a lot of fun. They're kind of turning the tables a little bit.
Right. For example, CMYK, right? Is it always CMYK? What if it was CKMY, whatever, like if I mess up this printer, my Canon printer next year to me, can I change the rhythm of those inks? What happens? Is it going to come out Technicolor? I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. We have an anonymous question. This is more about your practice as a design educator. How do you learn to handle critique on highly personal pieces? I tend to value myself on how much I can give to a project, but the critique can be devastating.
Oh no, so sorry to hear that. I mean, that's a great question. It's a Mr., Miss Anonymous, he, they, them. And the reason is that my personal philosophy is actually about looking at, especially for students, it's an opportunity to mine and explore personal interests, personal values, personal history, because I feel that is great preparation to enter a field that will knock you down because they want you to do what they want. Okay, because design, people think, and it's true partially, that it is a service, that you respond to somebody else's problem, not yours, right? And so can you accomplish both? Responding to your problem, your issues, your values, and then answering theirs as well, so that they see you as collaborative. So it is a big question. So I've learned many years ago when I've been teaching, as I said, almost maybe over 35 years now. And I think at the beginning, it was easy for me to just replicate my design practice. I would just say, oh, design the cover of this, or design a calendar for this museum, so that there was a client. Then I realized, wait a minute, that's for a design studio. That's not for a school. You want to teach your students to think. And so it doesn't have to have a client. The client is them. So I can create this project where they will eventually find that they can actually respond to other people's problems when they go out into the world, because they have dealt with their own. So that, when this person is asking me, how do I critique? I mean, this is easy for me because I find that is, to me, the foundational if I can say, it's really at the core of my role as an educator. In fact, I call my philosophy vital curriculum, vital meaning related to life, but then curriculum has an academic component. So you think, how can that be? Can you do that? And I say yes. So I always give projects where, the student has to reveal themselves, right? So if I say, you have to choose a person, place, or thing, which is actually a project I'm giving to my grad students now. I gave it last year during the pandemic because we were teaching virtually. And I thought, okay, you're all over the world. I don't know where you are. I'm not going to ask you. I want you to choose a person, place, or thing that is local to you, right? So if it's a place, then it's in your neighborhood. Then it's a place you go to, wherever it is. You could be in India, you could be in China, you could be in Japan, wherever, in Brooklyn. Then a person that who is connected to you now, right? And then the object. I want that object in your possession, or it could be something that you have access to. So, that was my kind of, my wily way of understanding, oh, you're in this part of the world. I get it. So without me asking, where are you? Right. So that was important to me. But what's the design question there? The question is, how do you then represent this item, this person, this place, and your connection with it? I want that. Is it in the form of a map? Because, or will you show me a record of your visits in the course of a week? Because you tell me, oh, Lucille, I go twice a week. And every time I go, this is what I do. Okay, you're great. That's great. So so that's the design problem, right? How do you show me frequency? How do you show data? By replicating or showing, how often you go to the place. Like if this experience is distilled in that person through this personal narrative, personal experience, this person is distilled in a design problem, design product, I am interested in that. And in fact, I don't give any medium restrictions. I just say, are you interested in interview? You like to interview somebody? Go ahead. Give me an interview. What form will it take? Is it a video? Are you good with editing? Yeah, don't make it tedious. Okay. An interview could be tedious, especially if you don't know them. So you're the editor, you're the designer. And so lastly, the one important thing I tell them is that, how do you show something without showing it? Don't literally show me that, but represent it. How do you do that? Right? It's like that first sketch that I showed with the letters A, G, and S. You didn't see a big A, you didn't see a big G, but it was defined by other things around it. So that is about non-visual, but provocative. Give me an example of how you show me a person. And if I tell them, okay, is it your parents? Okay. Or maybe your mother or your father? Okay. Show me your father tell me about your father without showing his picture. And so the student brought in a shirt that her father wore that he gave her. And I thought, amazing. This is like, you got it. You understood what I meant. And that shirt is so meaningful. He said, it's my father's favorite shirt. It's his favorite color, et cetera, et cetera.
That's wonderful. I like how you've kind of deliberately put some of these constraints and barriers there to make them kind of think around that, right? Otherwise, it's obvious. It's like, oh, I'll just do a portrait of my father.
Right.
And this is kind of getting beyond the initial obvious thing.
Yes. That's actually, Lishan, I tell them, there's the first column, which is literal, right? Name, how old, where is he from, the picture, where he lives, what he does. Okay, first column. Second column, what are you going to put in there? Okay, what does he mean? What does he mean to you? Right? So everything, it's like the first column is who, especially if it's a person. It's easy. Just give me the facts. Born in this, where, blah, blah, blah. The next column is what. What is that person? And when you ask somebody, what are you? I'm like, oh my God, I don't know how to answer that question.
Yeah.
So there you go. That's what you have. That's what you have to give me.
Definitely. So we have two final questions. They're both related to your teaching practice. I'll just put them together. The first one is, do you believe in the hamburger critique? So where you say something positive and then maybe something that's negative or needs improvement and then end with a positive. And then Parisa also has a question about, how do you think about assignments for visual design? Do you think they should be more creative and intriguing, like the one that you just shared, rather than adjusted with like these real world client pieces? Or how do you balance that, I think is the spirit of that question.
Okay, so what was the first part, Lishan,
do you
again?
do the
hamburger,
hamburger sandwich?
Okay, I've never heard of that described that way. But I when I was a young educator, I think I was harsher as a critic. Mm-hmm. I think it just is the kind of maybe it's the natural course of things, because you're practicing. You're a young designer. You're also a young educator, And so
Yeah.
you're being critical of your work, and then you're also being critical of your teaching, and then it extends to your students. So I remember when I was at CCA and I got a student evaluation, and I was unfiltered, and I one of the comments from an anonymous student, it said, "She stings dot 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 like a bee." And
Oh man, wow,
yeah,
that's
and I
intense.
thought, okay, what's this person's GPA? Oh, 2.5. Okay, well, maybe there's something going on here. But over time, I realized, especially when I started teaching graduate level, um, and also I think my understanding of what a teacher does in design school, that I realized some of these students have rich experiences, they have rich lives, and they have valid experiences that they can show you that you have no idea. So give them a chance, right? And so I started to, first of all, I decided, um, I will look at my students as equal partners. I'm just so happen to be older than them, but that they have rich lives and rich experiences that they can express in their work. I want to see that. So of course, you always get the range. Some students who are, just coasting, some students who really are, you know, over and above what you expect. And, they're the ones who would be out there in the world and define the profession. But you also get everything in between. And so I just want to tell, the way I deal with it is when I give critiques, I look for what is positive, one, but these projects that I tell you about, the personal stories, they are my beginning projects. They are my insight into who they are. And they give me a really good foundation. So when they move through the next project, the third project, I know where they're coming from. And so when they give to me a project that, is less than what I expect, I realize, oh, Lucille, that was reflected in that first project, and you try to understand where's that coming from. So now I mean, Lishan, I did not go to psychology school, right? I don't have a degree
Yeah.
in psychology, but over time you realize I love to plant seeds in these minds that it will not make sense to them, and it will be up to them to be out in the world and realize, what was that word she said? Typography as landscape. Oh, that's the only thing I remember from her. So
Yeah.
there's something that they'll remember that is memorable. And so that's the way I would critique. I mean, maybe it's not even a critique. I give my feedback based on who they are, what they're showing me, and then I'm not going to judge them based on what the others are doing. I can look at their work and just say, maybe you should explore this, whatever. And then your last question was, how do I combine? What did you say? It was about the
Yeah, some
person.
of the more like creative conceptual assignments, like the one you were talking about, the people, place, and thing,
Yeah,
with things that are maybe like real world client based
yeah.
kinds of assignments.
Well, the client, when you say client based, right? So the projects are, the end products can be seen as projects they could do for clients. So
Got it.
it may not telegraph themselves. So I'm not giving a project like designing a website, but I may say, your project for this third half of the semester is to go over your notes, go over who the speakers have been, what kinds of readings you've had, and then what if you were to do a microsite of your brain dump, let's just say,
Yeah.
of all the things that you've done in this, like, each semester is 15 weeks, right? Okay, so midterm, let's just say 8 weeks later, how can you make sense of that information in a website, right? How is that multiple, some are texts that you read, so that's authored by other people. How am I going to show that these were your reflections? Are they italicized? Are they in a different color? What's the hierarchy? They're all coexisting on the same page. So, when they go out there in the world and they show their work, people may say, well, who's a client here, right? So for
Yeah.
me, as a designer and who can also hire people, I'm more interested in how you think. When I was a young
Yeah.
designer showing my portfolio, one person who looked at my portfolio said, you know, this is an annual report company and you've never done an annual report, so I can't hire you. And so I said, well, can't you not see how I think? So that means if you like how I think, then that means I could do the things that you tell me to do. You know, so I can understand, take direction. So my rationale at the time, and I was a young designer, that I wasn't getting job offers, was that maybe my work is just too experimental. Or the other
Mhm.
thing is maybe they're not thinking deeply about my work. Maybe they just don't have the time. So I'm not meant for you. That's what I would just
Yeah,
say.
yeah, it
You
says
know what?
something about the client too, right? It's
Yeah.
like maybe this is not the client if they're just looking at things in such a maybe narrow way, or they're just trying to replicate something.
Yeah. No, yeah, I tell my students, you are looking at them in the way they are looking at you, but make sure this is your life. You
Yeah,
have to be in a job profession that you enjoy doing. And you know, it's okay at the beginning when you're just doing it for the money because you are young, you need to pay your rent, you need to pay your loans. But you got to get to a point where I am done with you. You know, it is no longer a place where I can thrive. So, and you have to, when do you know how to do that? When to do that? Because at a
yeah.
certain point, it is too late. And, you know, I always say longevity has to do with loving your work. You live longer if you're happy, right?
Yeah, hopefully.
That's what I would say.
Wonderful. Well, Lucille, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, your inspirations with us today. And thank you everyone for tuning in, sticking with us the whole time. This is being recorded, so we'll have the playback on aiga.org. You can also watch it on our LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube channels, so you can check it out there as well. Thanks again, Lucille. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll
Thank
see you at the
you.
next One
Thank
Designer,
you.
One Work. Bye-bye.
Okay, Lishan, thanks a lot.